Welcome back to another episode of Discovering Disruptions in Tech. I'm your host, Howard Holton, and I'm here with Rob from Forescout. And I would relay your job title, but I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself because they're getting pretty large lately.
Thanks, Howard. I am the SVP of Strategy, Alliances, and Business Development at Forescout.
Yeah, that's kind of a meaty title. What does that mean?
It means it means I own all the things nobody else wants to own. But what it means is I own the things that influence a lot of other parts of the business. So I work outside of sales, outside of marketing, outside of engineering, but I'm responsible for setting the strategy and setting the plans to help those functions in the business advance themselves in different areas, kind of looking forward while they're operating in today.
Oh, sure. It sounded a little bit like SVP of Junk Drawer.
Yep, the broken toys.
The broken toys. Yeah. Well, as a fellow broken toy, you know. So we started talking about something that's super interesting that we really haven't spent a lot of time on here at the wonderful Las Vegas show called Hacker Summer Camp. And that is, we're kind of on the precipice of this next revolution. And that revolution isn't AI, but rather quantum computing. And in addition to all the other things quantum computing has the potential to impact, its potential impact on cyber security is something we all really need to be aware of, whether you're planning on embarking as an early adopter or not doesn't really matter because this is an adversarial space.
Yep.
So what does quantum computing kind of mean for cybersecurity and maintaining that defensive position?
Yeah, it's one of these things that you're going to hear about it all the time in the news, and you're probably not going to see it until there is a groundbreaking availability, and we're not too far from it. But right now, the technology is closely guarded by the biggest companies and governments in the world. But the real kind of crux of what it means is everything we've done in the world of cybersecurity is predicated on this thought that we have things like encryption, which can help validate integrity of data. It can help secure the transmission of information from point A to point B. And most of that encryption is built on this theory that we can take a mathematical formula, a really complicated one, and run some data through this formula. And the math is so complicated that when we encrypt it once, if you don't have the key to the formula, it's very hard to mathematically break it.
Sure.
Because computers can only compute so much, and it would take a really long time.
Sure. So to kind of turn that into terms that anyone could understand, when we're talking about keys, you can think of it like the key to your house, right? Each one of the ridges, think of like a setting for that key, and it's fine, whatever setting you want. And for your house, really complicated home locks have 5, 6, or 7 keyways. Yep. When we're looking at encryption, we're looking at 1,024 keyways. Right. So I don't know, a key the size of a Buick.
Exactly.
Right. If we were to make it in reality.
And the other piece of this is the people who have created the encryption that we know today have said, okay, well, even if you've tried every possible example or every possible permutation, we're going to change the key in a short enough time that you won't be able to break it before we change it.
For sure. So if we take like a 1024 bit length key,
which is small,
which is small today. How long would it take to break that using current technology?
Depending on if you're using like additional salting or things like that, it would take sometimes years, many years, depending on how much compute power you have, but typically measured in years or lots of years, many years.
And today we're running like 512-bit K-bit, right?
Well, there's different cipher strengths.
Sure.
And then there's different key sizes.
Right.
Right. So 1024 is typically the key size, and then there's a cipher strength, which is things like AES and different encryption algorithms that are layered on top of that. But the key size is really what makes the difference in how long it would take to calculate and potentially defeat.
But we're talking hundreds or thousands of years in theory. And again, we rotate our keys every so often, right? The certificates expire.
Every year now.
Right. Unless you use something like Let's Encrypt, in which case they expire every 30 days.
Yep.
Right. Some of the open source stuff expires really, really quick. So there's conceivably, it's a inconceivable possibility that you can crack the key using traditional kind of cracking methodology.
Before the key rotates, yes.
Correct. So now we start talking about quantum computing, and that math changes.
Right. And the big difference is every computer we've had since we've created computers has been built on this concept of binary logic,
Right.
1 or 0, which means you can have so many ones and so many zeros, which translate into computer code, which then translates into the instructions, which can run through a processor or a different type of computation engine inside of the computer
Sure.
that says I can do math at a certain speed using
But
those
it's
ones
still,
and zeros.
I can only flip bits at this rate.
Correct.
Right, and that's effectively Moore's law, right? Moore's law kind of defined the rate of improvement of the ability to develop that compute power, which still just said I flip bits at this rate.
Right.
Right. I flip switches, a 1 or a 0, an on or an off, at this rate.
Correct.
And even when we look at GPUs and TPUs and DPUs, they're still stuck in kind of this same binary universe, even
Right.
though they're dedicated and purpose built. They still don't have the ability to monumentally change the speed and suddenly go from thousands of years to 10 minutes on cracking these things, right?
Correct, because
So
it's a
still
game.
inconceivable.
It's a game of how many ones and zeros can you move and how fast can you do it.
Right.
And that is our current limitation on what we call, modern or traditional computing. Except now we have this concept of quantum, which changes things.
Right. So how does quantum change things from ones and zeros, from the standard kind of light switch that we've built up over the years to these billions of circuits?
So it really boils down to the simplest nature in how we treat the most common element of computing, right? You mentioned bit, which is binary. It's 1 or 0, right? It's on or off. It's very basic in nature. It can only be one thing. It can be one or the other. And when you move to quantum, we introduced this new concept called the qubit. And we just added 2 letters in front, and we've made a new bit. And the interesting thing about the qubit is it doesn't have to follow the same rules as a binary bit. It can be a 1, it can be a 0, or it can be both. And when you add that other attribute or that other parameter, you now introduce a massive amount of mathematical advantage, because you can now use that concept to move math through a computer system at 100 or 1,000 or 1 million times the current pace that we are used to, just by changing that one advantage of what we call superposition. It could be 1, 0, or both. And there's a lot of nuances around how we use it, and it actually dives really deep into this sort of quantum theory around particles and how things move, and it's kind of almost science fiction that's
Sure.
becoming science fact.
Sure.
Sometimes when I read articles, I wonder if I'm reading something out of Marvel or I'm reading something that is
Right.
actually happening.
Something that Gene Roddenberry wrote, right? Like, I'm sorry, did I just read about the computer on the Starship Enterprise? This is odd, right?
Yeah.
So what that means is we're moving decimal places in the time that it takes to do work. It's effectively the promise of quantum computing,
Yes.
right? So that thing that would have taken 1,000 years to do may take 1,000 minutes to do.
Yeah.
Conceivably, theoretically, right?
it-
Like
the-
we really don't know what the scope of that is. We just know what the potential of that is.
It's advancing by the day. If you kind of follow the news, every day you hear another breakthrough. Either IBM or Google or some state government has said we've now achieved a computing state of 700 qubits or 1,000 qubits. And the concept is, what is the maximum capability this computer can perform based on how many qubits it can keep in residence storage and memory and use.
Right.
Now there's some nuances in terms of how communication happens, and there are things like entanglement that makes the communication between those things more efficient, and we're in the early phases of learning how to build quantum computers. I mean, the real infancy. We're talking like we're in the 486 processor with the
I was thinking we're much more in the
we're not a
punch
Pentium
card stage.
We're not anywhere near the Pentium yet.
I still think it's punch cards. Right?
Yeah.
Like at the 486 phase, you could afford to put one on your home desk.
Yes.
Theoretically.
Oh yeah,
they were
these
still
things
very expensive.
Yeah. These are not available to the modern.
These are
person.
monumentally expensive. They're very, very large. They're not commercially viable.
Right.
The energy necessary to run them makes them the least efficient computers that we have in the modern space, right?
Correct.
All of that stuff goes together, not just the kind of issues around it, but all of that stuff goes together to say we are not at the stage where you're going to encounter quantum computing in the wild. It is currently, while it is different and while it is amazing, we are currently at the baby steps phase. right? It may eventually be a dinosaur that has the ability to eat you in one bite, but
Correct.
today it's not. Today it's a single-celled organism.
Correct. But it is advancing day by day, and there is a ton of money being poured into the research and development, and they are reaching breakthroughs probably by the
Constantly.
minute. Yeah.
Sure.
And they're being controlled and funded by some of the biggest companies and governments of the world.
Sure, they have no choice.
Yeah.
Right. We're reaching the limits of what we can do with modern silicon.
Correct.
Right? So in order to support the workloads of the future, quantum computing has to get to the point where it's commercially viable. In order to do that, we're going to invest billions and billions of dollars, likely trillions of dollars as a global economy in developing the next version of computing. And that next version of computing is going to be alien from this version of computing.
100%.
Right? It's going to be the same kind of alien level as punch cards to mainframe.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And this is why it represents the probably most dramatic shift we'll ever see in our lifetimes from what we know as modern computing and security to what we will see in the next couple years and maybe decade.
Yeah, I think we're 5 to 7 years away from commercial viability. Regardless, that doesn't change anything.
Correct.
If you think about the organizations that we work at, that we support, that we've worked at in the past, that our customers run, how many of those systems are running modern enough security, like that they have a pace of modernization that would keep up with that evolution?
In sense of cryptography, probably less than 0.1%.
Right. So effectively zero.
Yeah.
Right. That's the concern. Like the concern isn't that this is going to show up and be the next revolution. The concern is that this is going to show up. It's going to fundamentally change the landscape, and we are so slow to move that the danger will be ready and apparent and here and immediate.
And the danger is here now. There is this sort of thought of store now, decrypt later.
Sure.
Right. Imagine you've got all this data moving around the world, but we can't decrypt it now if you're an adversary, but you can capture that data and store it, and then when that quantum compute becomes available,
For sure.
you can then decrypt it.
For sure. I always run into the issue of at some point there's a limited number of things that I could ever possibly deal with. That one, I don't know how to deal with that one. How do we deal with that one?
So there's a couple things you can do. One, there has been advances in cryptography to create what's called post-quantum cryptography safe cipher suites or encryptions. There's a few out there, very limited list. The National Institute for Standards and Technology, I forget the acronym, but NIST. They produced a list of the ones that have currently been deemed safe. And there are probably cryptos that you've probably never heard of.
Sure. Of course they are.
It's all of the ones that nobody has ever heard of.
Right.
And they're the ones that are adopted by almost nothing.
Sure.
It is one of those technologies that imagine every single web server, every single banking application, every single web client has to adopt and support these technologies for it to even be potentially available to work. So
for sure, there's a scale issue for any cryptography whatsoever to get it to the point where it's efficient, to get to the point where it's adopted, to get to the point where you have we'll call it herd immunity.
Yep.
To steal a phrase from another industry.
Yeah, and then think about all the devices we have been creating and have put into the world. OT devices, IoT devices, the things we've been deploying that have really small compute processors, really small storage, or just are limited in how they can be patched or upgraded. Right, those are things that will never see quantum safe encryption.
Right, they don't have the compute power necessary to do the math necessary to create the encryption in the first place.
Right, or they just can't get the update to get the latest crypto library. And this is probably one of those things that we're going to see in a couple of years become a real problem. If you kind of think, you've got things like ATMs that are deployed everywhere. You've got things like robots and programmable logic controllers and all kinds of devices out there that have either no encryption, very, very low forms of encryption, or even things that are the latest and greatest IoT device that could control building automation or health systems inside of hospitals.
I mean, the things that are in airplanes, the things that are in cars, the things that are in tractors, the things that are in ships.
Yep.
Right. All of that stuff is computer controlled to some degree. None of that stuff is using a very powerful piece of silicon.
Right.
Right. Like the automobile shortage during COVID.
Right. The chip
Right. When they
shortage.
couldn't get the chips. Those were not modern chips.
Couldn't get heated seats if
Right. But those weren't modern chips. Like the problem wasn't they couldn't get a modern Intel chip, they couldn't get a Broadcom chip, they couldn't get an AMD chip. The problem was they couldn't get this goofball silicon that they made 30 years ago that was a low priority to produce anyhow and cost 2 cents per chip.
Yeah.
Right. The problem is they don't update. Industry doesn't update. We just don't. We're bad at it.
And it's expensive. Even
tooling is expensive.
Cybersecurity for every company in the world, it's an expense line item.
100%.
It's not a profit center. It costs the company money to invest in cybersecurity. So this is one of those things where we've been kind of staying in front of the adversaries by using traditional tools.
Sure.
We install antivirus software. We put in firewalls. We look at network visibility, and we put all kinds of controls in the network to say, okay, well, we're going to wrap this bubble around the network and protect enough, and it'll be okay. And we've always relied on this thought that, well, we're transmitting data over the internet, and it's safe because it's encrypted.
Sure.
So we can move information from bank A to bank B, or from person to bank, or from government to government, or from what have you to wherever. And there's this thought as it leaves your network and transmits over the public internet, it's safe because it has been encrypted with an algorithm that can't be broken by anything today.
Sure.
And this is what is changing. That whole theory that we trust the data as it's moving, or trust the data while it's sitting, is no longer viable once quantum computing becomes available to a nation state, a large company, even a threat actor. And there is a race, an arms race, to commercialize quantum computing for the masses. Which means you've got this, 20, 30 billion devices out there in the world that are vulnerable to quantum computing, decryption capabilities, and then the availability of quantum compute, which basically means anybody, an attacker, a hacktivist group, a nation state, can say, any of the data we captured 2 years ago or today, we can decrypt, and it can be sensitive, like information from State Departments or government agencies or banks.
Absolutely anything.
It's at their fingertips now.
Right. So, this is starting to feel a lot like a climate change conversation.
Kind of like Y2K.
Right. Well, way worse, because we all know what happened with Y2K. It was effectively like we did enough work that it was nothing.
But there was a lot of fear stoking.
Sure. But it feels a lot like climate change.
Yeah.
Right. Climate change is larger than any of us. It's here. Yeah. It's not going away. And depending on who you listen to, we're either about to eclipse the point of no return, or we've already eclipsed the point of no return. And so, as an individual, it's really hard to conceptualize. Well, what can I do to fix this?
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't sound like there's anything I can do to fix this.
There are behaviors and things we can think about today. Like, for example, the government keeps talking about making standard requirements on companies adopting quantum safe encryption or PQC type algorithms. Those standards can be put into place. But again, when those standards are put in, there's usually a gap in time, right?
Sure.
Even when we made the emission standards for cars, right? There was like a 15-year window to get to 4 more miles per gallon.
Yep.
Right, so there's going to be a window where organizations have to modernize, but within that window, it's a race of, well, am I going to get there fast enough, or can I even get there fast enough? I mean, there are companies running devices that were built 50 years ago.
100%.
It's almost impossible to modernize those things without taking a factory offline, a hospital offline, an aircraft carrier offline, whatever
the device is,
application. Right. And there's just a reality that some things cannot be updated, some things cannot be patched. So the question is, what do you do?
Right. That is absolutely the question, right? And so I think we need to start from the perspective of really taking stock of what we're doing today. And then we need to apply a legal term called reasonability.
Yep.
What is reasonable for us to protect today versus what is reasonable for us to protect tomorrow, right? When we all started going through the process of data protection, and we said, well, we want this like platinum, gold, silver tiers of application reliability and application protection, every single person said, well, I'm platinum for sure.
Of course.
My application is platinum for sure.
Yeah.
Right? And we overspent like crazy to make way too many applications platinum. What we should have said was every application is silver and has to go through a process to get promoted.
Yeah.
And I kind of think we now need to start doing the same thing with data.
Yeah.
Right? We kind of need to go, hey, Not every piece of data must be protected to the same level. Let's really focus on those things where the data is critical and really start working on those systems today.
Right, we can't boil the ocean. I mean,
correct.
And this is typically the largest problem that organizations or even anybody can, it's where do you begin to start to pick apart? One, it's understanding what data you have.
Right.
One of the biggest challenges any organization has is understanding what they have to protect. Right, the visibility into how much data do you have, how many assets do you have, where are the risks? That's not an easy answer for most companies. It's not an easy answer for some of the governments of the world or the biggest banks or hospitals, right?
No, for sure.
There's this sprawl of connected things. There is this sprawl of users who are putting information into these things.
Right.
And there's no single place where all that information is reported. You know, there's no master Excel spreadsheet that says, okay, all my healthcare data is in these 5 systems, and
Thank
all
God.
my.
Thank God. Thank God there's no Excel spreadsheet
But I'm
that
willing
says,
to bet there is an Excel spreadsheet with all the passwords.
I'm willing to bet. Right. And then there's another one that has the social security number.
Yes.
And somebody
has
hear
wrote
this,
all those things
and they're going
down.
to put them together.
Yes.
Right. But that's a really good point, right? Like, we need to start from the perspective of, we need to make a promise that there are no passwords stored in an Excel file in a non-secure location, that there are no social security numbers stored in a place where we cannot internally regulate them.
Yes.
Like, we need to start with those things. So we can make a promise that we're being good data custodians of the most critical data and get those into systems that we can raise to that quantum-proof level of encryption very, very, very quickly. If there's one system that has that, make sure that that stuff is the only is stored there and nowhere else.
And there have been some attempts and advances. I mean, in the healthcare industry, there is a lot of energy spent around protecting patient data. Right? There's this concept of what's called PHI.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of energy put into identifying what PHI is, identifying where it is, and making sure it stays compartmentalized and not leave certain parts of the network.
Kind of.
There's at least an attempt.
Right. I just say that because I'm constantly receiving a letter, hey, we were hacked from some medical system that we belong to.
But again,
constantly.
Even if you keep it in the system that is supposed to be the safe system, it doesn't mean that system is protected from a breach or protected from the attack.
Correct.
You've taken the step to say, don't put it on an Excel spreadsheet.
Right.
Put it in this protected document on the server.
Sure, but I'd rather it was in the protected document on the server. We just need to then take the next step and make sure those things are actually secure.
Right.
That we're not allowing policy to be violated. That we're not undoing the MFA requirement. That we're not over provisioning permissions.
Yeah.
Right. That we're doing all of the things, and that's easier to do in one system than it is in 5,000.
And this is the challenge: is there are 5,000 systems.
Right.
And there will be 5,000 more. And as we adopt more and more smart things and more new devices and more things that are connected and making life, easier to operate, we connect more of these things.
Well, but we also need to then we also need to revisit our risk tolerance, and admit we have a much bigger risk tolerance than we thought, because the option is we spend far more money than we have.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you exchange dollars for risk. There is no other exchange.
That's it.
So if you don't have the dollars, you must accept the risk. You can't say this risk is unacceptable and I'm not giving you the money to solve it.
Right.
Right? And so if we start from that perspective, like, get in that mindset today and right now, suddenly things that were untenable yesterday suddenly become tenable. Like, I hate to reduce this to something so simple, but if I effectively say IoT is a loss, right? Then the only thing that I can then do is segment those networks, segment that blast radius so much that if I assume that's always compromised, and will always be compromised, then the data can't be of that import, the data can't be that critical, and the traffic can never touch the areas where it is critical.
That's a key foundation to this concept of zero trust, which, again, it starts with understanding what you have.
Right.
But everything you've mentioned so far is predicated on this thought of, well, I'm worried about the information leaking out. Right?
Sure.
And mostly every single breach you hear about is there's been some information loss. That's
100%.
typically been the worst thing so far, right? We've lost data. At this point, so what? Like, what, my personal information is all over the internet. Like, it's all out there already, so
Sure.
So what? Now, the real question is going to be, once these attacks affect things that interact with everyday lives, when they go and
100%.
interact with the things inside of hospital rooms, when they affect the manufacturing or assembly line of a pharmaceutical company,
Right.
or they start to tamper with smart cities or grids or electric utilities, right? Like, these are all the things that we haven't really seen at wide scale. We've seen a few of them here and there.
Sure.
And we've based the thought that, well, we're transmitting the passwords in encrypted channels. So nobody can access that system because it's encrypted until somebody has the way to beat the encryption. Right? So right now our biggest fear is losing data, losing information, and reporting it, and doing all those things.
But we're on the precipice of losing control completely.
Yes.
And that goes back to what we started this whole conversation around, which is, if it takes X number of days, years, to crack the security, then you must change significantly faster than that. You move the decimal place on expirations. Yes. Right? And so now we get into a situation of, as this starts to become more and more of a reality, we also need to be in a position to be expiring those passwords and changing those passwords and doing those updates at a much faster rate.
Changing behaviors, right? And we've known the problem with passwords for probably 2 decades now, and we still suffer from account compromise, phishing attempt. I mean, the same attacks still keep happening.
The exact same attacks still keep happening.
And even with multi-factor, I mean, we came and said, okay, well, we'll give you a code, and somehow somebody's figured out how to beat those things. And we've gone to passwordless and device-based authentication, and the adversaries are always figuring out the next steps.
Sure. Well, that's why they're called adversaries, right?
And once they have the advantage of more compute power than you have access to, is when the scales really tip.
For sure. Well, we can hope that some of that will be mitigated through international treaty.
Hopefully.
Right? It has to be. I don't know that there's going to be an option for a long time, right? Some moratorium on the sale of quantum computing outside of very, very restrictive channels.
Yes, but then you have to also worry about the nation states that are developing it themselves as well.
No, you absolutely do.
Looking to use it for those exact reasons.
Sure, but then you get into a Cold War, right? And we're definitely getting closer and closer and closer to that, right? Yeah. When you talk to those guys that are in military R&D, their conversation is the battlefield is digital, the battlefield is digital, the battlefield is digital, the battlefield is digital. They realize it and recognize it. They may not be properly armed today or equipped or missioned to manage it the way we'd like, those of us that work in the field and work in the industry. I think that has more to do with congressional oversight from whatever country you're in, right? Nobody is hiring us as congressmen.
Yeah, and
right? If you think about kind of the level of understanding of those folks with technology, putting a rifle in someone's hand and sending them into a foreign location makes a lot of sense. Putting them in front of a computer in a bunker we're in Nevada, right? Yeah. Where a lot of the drone command was and is. That doesn't make as much sense. Like, that took decades for them to kind of get behind. But we now need to get to the point where that's the reality, where that's what's happening, where that's kind of how we run these things, and where the digital frontier is the battlefield.
And the other aspect to consider is the battlefield is not controlled only by the governments, right? There's a lot of dependency on the public and private infrastructure. So, for example, we're sitting here in this room, connected to the internet that is controlled by a private company.
Many private companies, right? Not one.
Consuming power, which is from a private company.
Yep.
And that's the same internet and the same power that the military bases use to, run those drone commands and, launch all different missions from. So, there is this aspect that we need everybody to be on board with the 100%. Same level of investment, because it's not just the government from that country is going to attack our government. They might attack a private power grid and take out power to where the bases are that can operate the drones, which is your preemptive.
Sure, and they might do it in 12 seconds.
Yeah.
Right? This may no longer take years of work to try to find a flaw.
Yeah.
This may take 12 seconds to find a flaw.
And if you see every one of these breaches or any one of these attacks, the attacker has been in for a long enough time to figure out how to extract the maximum amount of damage to an organization.
They've been in as long as they possibly can be in.
Yeah.
Right? The last thing you do is push the big red button that says encrypt everything and run away.
Yeah.
Right? The rest of the time, you've been in there the entire time trying to figure out, one, do they see me? And two, how much data can I get?
Yeah.
And have they seen me yet? Right? So it's not until they see you that you run away. And you push that button as you exit.
Yeah.
Right? So that's not going to change.
No.
Like, that behavior's not going to change. It's the same behavior of everyone that's done anything similar, right?
It's just now there are new tools, and it's an arms race to who has the biggest advantage over offense versus defense.
For sure.
And there's a point where we've typically have built enough defense to repel the offense as much as we can, and when the advent of quantum, we're kind of giving the offense a lot more power, because our defense has been predicated on the thought that well, nobody can break the encryption.
It's been predicated on this is a reasonably level playing field.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's fundamentally what we've said.
Yeah. But back to your point, what do? Well, we know patching everything and updating everything and getting everything to be compliant encryption is probably unrealistic. We move towards this concept of, okay, well, let's just protect it from the adversary or firewall it off. Maybe we'll get everything, maybe we won't. We need
but the perimeter's destroyed.
Yeah.
Right? We no longer have a perimeter that we can rely on,
Yeah.
so we can't reinforce the perimeter. I will say, however, getting in the habit of having good habits, getting in the habit of patching everything really, really, really quick can absolutely help. Because at some point, Microsoft's going to figure out the right quantum-proof encryption to start rolling out. Linux, Apple are going to do the same thing, right? The device manufacturers are going to take the steps that they are capable of taking. Application manufacturers are going to take the steps they're capable of taking, and the longer you delay, the bigger target you will be.
Yeah, and that's good for a lot of the computers of the world. But when you think about a lot of the IoT devices,
devices are a totally different thing, right?
They're not controlled by Microsoft, or there's no central Linux.
Sure, but they may also not have the computing power necessary to do it. There may be other limitations, right? But if we think about, yes, we have to get our arms wrapped around the totality, but we're also harming ourselves on the things that could be fixed.
Yeah.
Let's stop stabbing ourselves in the face on the things that could be fixed,
yeah.
and at least try to solve that one, right? At least let's reduce the blast radius by really improving our hygiene so that we're able to stay current with the things that can be fixed. And then we can spend a lot more time focusing on how do we deal with the things that can't be fixed? How do we replace the things? How do we update those things?
There's a simple terminology that we use. It's called compliance.
Yeah.
And it's in its most basic form. There are certain things you expect to be true of the things you want to comply with. And making a checklist of what those things are and making sure that everything meets that criteria is the most basic way to really take an advantage over some of these modern attacks that happen.
Sure.
Some of the things you see happen are, hey, it's a vulnerability from a patch that was released 10 years ago.
Right.
Nobody patched anything.
Well,
or it's a computer that didn't have
Log4j wasn't a current issue.
But there wasn't that many attacks that happened with that. A lot of the ransomware stuff you see are really, really old ways 100%. Into Windows.
100%. Right? I worked at a company that acquired a company that right after acquisition, they got ransomware. And it was exactly that. It was aged infrastructure that hadn't been patched, and the flaw had been patched for a long time. Right? We see that constantly. But Log4j, that caused all the panic, that had been patched for a long time.
Yeah. But was it fully deployed? And that was the...
Oh, no.
Right.
But it was deployed everywhere, and it was deployed in a million places you didn't know was deployed.
Yeah.
Right? Because that was one of the most commonly reused libraries by everybody.
Yeah.
Right? There's a whole bunch of reasons why that happened, but the reality, to your point, right, and kind of back to my point, is we have to get to the point where we're current. Otherwise, when this stuff can be cracked in 12 minutes, you have 11 minutes to patch.
Yeah.
Right? So we can no longer say, well, we have a 9-month testing procedure we go through.
Right.
That needs to be 9 days.
And if we can't do it fast enough, we need to be able to isolate and protect and at least try to harden ourselves from where that potential
right. Reduce the blast radius, even if it means we disconnect things.
Yeah.
Right? Even if it means we really get good at segmenting, sometimes even darkening, things that we've currently got connected.
Yeah. It's the reality we live in.
It is.
Too many things are trying to communicate with too many things, and we don't have enough understanding of it.
That is very, very true. Well, as much as this has been a ton of fun, I think we're going to end on that note. Stay informed, stay up to date, really focus on those things that you can do. This has been another episode of Discovering Disruptions in Tech. This was a big disruption. Please like, follow, subscribe, comment, and share. If you have questions, reach out. If you'd like to be on an episode, reach out. And we'll see you on our next episode. Thank you.